Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Reed Heddick, and I'm here with Mr. Franklin, one of the final candidates for the Aurora Police Chief job, and here with community members Aspen and Janina. And we're going to have a bit of a conversation. Thanks for joining us. Mr. Franklin, thank you for being here, and thanks for being a candidate and being involved here. So a question I have for you is, why are you the most qualified person to be our next Chief of Police?
Yeah, I think qualifications, when you talk about that for a place like Aurora, for me, one of the things that you got to bring to this particular agency at this time is change. And while being under a consent decree, I think my experiences with a consent decree agency in Albuquerque give some insight to what needs to be changed. You know, and we've heard a lot about culture change, you know, and that's needed. And so a consent decree is only a roadmap. Culture change is only going to be as good as the leadership that's in there. You know, I say leadership is simply about influence. Right, and you got to have somebody that knows how to influence and knows how to get things changed. You know, and that takes a kind of a community of a whole. You know, and one of the things that we did in Albuquerque is created community police councils in each of our area commands, which I'd want to replicate here, so that way those people in those districts have that voice. And then the commanders and the officers that are in those districts hear direct from the people instead of just from me. So I can preach one thing, but the beat that they're actually working, those people that are there, they need to be able to be heard to by the people that are policing in that area. And so we also have what we call the ambassador program, you know, and we've got to change that, in which we have ambassadors for the police department that not only look like, but also have shared, you know, events in their life. Maybe they're a veteran, maybe they're a part of the LGBTQ, maybe it's race, maybe it's religion. And we've done that in Albuquerque, and that was under my command. So I really think when I've looked at what culture is here, what the consent decree said to do, how we bring people on board, and then really how we communicate. Again, I'm not going to be, you know, the single person that's able to connect with every single person out there, but I can mandate that the PD does. You know, I can communicate and I can get with whoever I can get with and who would listen to me. I like to talk. So I'm originally from, you know, from Texas, and I like to engage with people. And so that's going to be a priority. But I think culture change, and you do that first off by bringing people in to share their story, and the line officers in those districts need to understand that, right? And so hopefully I could bring that, and I think with the experience not only in Albuquerque, but with the state police in Texas, you know, I worked 17 years in organized crime that was specifically for auto theft, the criminal intelligence aspect of it, getting information on groups, narcotics, and gang investigations. And with that, we see a lot of that here, you know, with some of our crime spikes. You know, it's not just answering calls for service, but what I bring is a very engaging and organized criminal activity style background in which we actually go after the groups. I always say this: if we get the groups that are causing the problems, we don't have to have the perception of over-policing, especially in certain high crime areas, right? So it's no longer about having to go in there and do mass policing to calm down crime. We do very targeted, pinpoint, micro hotspotting against those groups of those commodities. So with those experiences, I think I can bring something to Aurora, you know, but I'd let the people of Aurora decide if I'm the best or not. So
That's great. Thank you. Aspen?
Yes, I love that. So what is your vision for the police department, and, you know, how will you improve the trust with the police department in the community?
Yeah, so one of the things I think is most important, you know, when we talk about vision statements, you know, I talked about that earlier today. Here's my vision statement. The Aurora Police Department will be a constitutional, relationship-based policing organization, and that is it. And when you think of that, and if you break that down, right, constitutional policing, which all of our constitutional rights as people that we all have, and relational policing. You know, early on in the Texas Department of Public Safety, they told us this: every time you make a traffic stop or every time you go on a scene, you have an opportunity to build or break a relationship. Since 1993, the state police has had that motto in Texas, and I bring that wholeheartedly, and I'm a firm believer in relational. You'll hear people say, I'm community-oriented, I'm problem-oriented policing, I'm intelligence-led policing. I even think the brochure here for the city said that we embrace intelligence-led, so we're trying to do data-driven and not emotional-driven. But I want to take all those and say, look, we can have all three of those pieces, but my vision is that we become a relational policing agency. And when you build relationships, hard conversations are going to happen. And hard conversations have got to kind of go both ways. And I tell people that, you know, but conversations that are hard that we both listen to and that we actually can share, our stories and the why behind it, not just the what, then we can start building trust and we can start reducing those tensions. So again, my vision is a constitutional relation-based policing agency. And that's a big vision, and there's a lot of goals we got to get to. But I think what the people want and the people need nationwide, it's not just Aurora, nationwide, is to develop a relationship between community and the police department. And I've said this a bunch, and this is not my quote, this is another quote. It says, the badge makes us more a part of the community, not more a part from the community. And I think that's important, right? And so when we look at that, when you look at a philosophy of culture, this Aurora badge makes you a part of the Aurora community. It's not your job to divide the community, it's to bring the community together. And so that's really my vision and overall goal. And I think officers will definitely embrace, they're part of the community here. Mm-hmm. But they need a goal, they need a vision, they need a set, and they need a standard. And that's what I'm going to bring to it.
Great. Jadina?
All right. Tell us about your approach to reducing crime and the fear of crime.
Sure. And I think felt safety is something that you never really hear chiefs talk about, right? So we can say, hey, there's low crime in this area, there's high crime in this area. That's all the what. The how people feel. Will you want to walk down that street? Do you feel safe to do that, right? And so part of crime is we've got to use a community of whole. The police department cannot be the only department in the city that makes the city safe, actually, or felt safe. I'll give you an example. If we have bad lighting, then we need to change out those lighting, make it LED lightings, make them more 360 lighting, right, instead of just something that's on the curb where people step off. With more lighting, it's called crime prevention through environmental design. Mm-hmm. So if we can use CPTED to get areas where people like, man, it's just a little too dark, it's this, you know what I mean? And we can hear that from the community, then I think that's up to other departments in the city to help us out with that crime prevention through environmental design. Also, we've got to be very precision, and you'll hear people, use chief speak buzzwords, you know what I mean, about precision policing, place network investigations, all these other kind of stuff. And what I like to say is, I want to set goals and objectives that are specific. And I'll give you an example. If we're going to use intelligence-led strategies to target what we know as hotspots of crimes, those hotspots move every 24 hours based on the calls for service. So I would tell the people of Aurora, and I would tell the police officers, my philosophy is we are going to find out what's driving crime, who's facilitating crime, and where are the anchors of crime. And when you change it up like that, and we tell the community, look, we're looking for drivers, facilitators, and anchors of crime, and we have the community input. This is an anchor. This is a location we all know. These are facilitators. This is why it's happening. Drivers. And I'll give you an example. It could be something as simple as a disrespect on YouTube that creates two different factions to maybe want to try to shoot at each other, right? It could be a dope deal that we know it's an anchor, same intersections. There's still multiple dope deals going on. So I would tell them, your job is to find commanders and division chiefs, drivers, facilitators, and anchors, and then we're going to address those with precision, pinpoint, not over policing. We got to take care of that 10% of the problem that's creating 90% of the havoc, on crime.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so tell us your strategy to recruit, retain, and promote a diverse police force.
Sure. Retention right now, with the number of officers that are down everywhere, retention is what has to be your stopgap. If we are losing 60, 70 a year and we're only getting 30, obviously we're already negative, and we're going to continue to be negative every year, and we've seen that for the last 2 years here in Aurora and across the nation, actually. So, we've got to retain those officers that are good officers. We've got to let those officers that ain't so good, that just want to leave because they don't want to change, we got to let them go, and we can't worry about them. We've got to bring in the right people. And we've talked about, some of the challenges, and I think I'm going to speak on the consent decree, and I hope that this is more based on the consent decree, is, the civil service in the consent decree says that it needs to be some change. The police department doesn't have a whole lot of say in a lot of those processes, but the police department's held accountable for the actions of that process. So really for me, what I want to do is if I come here and get selected, I'd want to change that process, that we who are going to be out there in the community meetings and who are going to be listening to people, tell the recruiters the profile of who we want to hire. And what is that, right? That's the next question. Thinkers, compassionate, right? If we have an all-white force and a diversity that Aurora is known for, then how do we come across, we can be very professional, but are we going to have that link, right? And so I think we've got to just do better across the nation. So we got to retain to do a stopgap. And we've got to specifically target, and I'll give you an example when I mean specifically target. In Albuquerque, I had the recruiting unit, and I told them, I said, look, this is what I want you guys to do. The days of just putting a flyer up and the days of just saying, here's how much money we make and here's some health benefits and come work for us are over. I said, I want you guys to definitely showcase, and we called it the difference is phase 1 and phase 2 is make a difference. So when the difference is what makes Albuquerque special? I would do the same thing here. What makes Aurora special? What's the difference? Why should you be here? From there, we would put a campaign out that says make a difference. And I want people to make a difference. I don't want people just to come in just because we want to fill numbers. I would rather run a little short than to bring in the wrong people. But we have got to be able to have some of that control back at the PD instead of the first time we see them is at the academy. And so that's just one thing, that I think we really need to work on.
Okay.
Yeah, as you mentioned and as you know, Aurora is under a consent decree, and there are 3 issues in the consent decree that are racially based policing, use of force, and documentation. So describe your strategies and plan to address those issues.
Yeah, so on documentation in Texas, we've had this requirement by state law for a long time, right? Did you know the race before or after the stop? Was there a search involved in the stop, yes or no? Was there contraband found? I mean, all these questions that are listed. In talking with Aurora, what I found out is the officers have to log into a whole separate system to be able to try to do that and try to match it up to another system, right? And when we start crossing systems that don't talk to each other, we have a problem. Whether that is in, I don't know that that's, some malice that they don't want to do. I think it's just process generated. So the first thing I do to document that is to create in what we call our CAD system, or computer assisted dispatch. I'd have, just like in Texas, you can hit a button on your screen that says I'm out on a consensual stop or I'm out on a traffic stop, and then automatically a tab puts up, you hit it, and then you answer all those questions, and that data is captured every single time, and it doesn't burden the officers. It takes seconds, and drop downs, nothing to type, no mistaking. And then we get that data that we need, right? So this has been done in Texas for a very long time. We can bring that same model here, and we can make it very efficient for the officers. Make the data to a point where anybody that asks for it, we could have a third-party auditor come in and say, I'm going to pull that data from the CAD. And we have had this done in Albuquerque for other places where they were able to gain access and look at the CAD, so that way they could kind of testify, for lack of better terms, that they were actually to pull the data. And what does it mean? What's the so what behind that data? So again, we need to get the data. I think there's ways to do it. We just need to implement that with new technology, new software. And again, that will be an investment from the city. So with the other points of use of force, I know we've just started a force team. In Albuquerque, we have an internal affairs force division and an internal affairs professional standards division. Anything that force only goes to the force only goes up through the force chain of command to a deputy chief and then to the superintendent of reform. So not knowing all the ins and outs of all the histories of force and discipline and the chains that went up, I'd like to model where if it's a force issue like they have now, I'd like to give that unit a little, some more bodies that they could really look at it. And then I want that to be able to go up. And again, I know with civil service, I want it to come straight through the chain of command, straight to me, and then we make those decisions and then get it to civil service. There's some ways that we can put some checks and balances in that. And I think like we did in Albuquerque, we hired a former judge, and he is now the superintendent of police reform instead of a police officer. And so we have this third party out there. And so could we bring somebody else in that's kind of knows labor law, kind of knows a lot of things, and before we ever send anything off, can we put one other individual person in that is really able to look at that and from a legal mind? And that's something that we did with Judge Valdez in Albuquerque, and I think it's going to bring instant credibility when you've got a former judge being able to sit there and talk to the monitors about really what's happening instead of a police officer. So I'm very much in favor of that. And then use of force. it is an inevitable fact that when you are trying to take certain people into custody and they do not want to go to jail, there is going to be what we call resistance. And the key to this is constitutional policing, right? There are set standards. Every police officer knows them from day one. And there's the U.S. Constitution, and then the U.S. Supreme Court really outlines what we call the basics. And police departments are now going away from saying, hey, our use of force model is the Graham standard, which is Graham versus Connor, I'm sorry. And what we need to do is make sure that we are following best practices and not just saying, well, state law says this, that's our use of force. Graham versus Connor says this, that's what our case law is going to be, and that's what our use of force policies are going to follow. What we need to do is establish best practices. And we need to have those best practices from outside entities. And when I say that is the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the Police Executive Research Forum, or you'll hear it called PERF. So PERF, IACP, a lot of those get nationwide for best practices. And what we really need to do is change the ideology that says, well, what works for Aurora? No, what about best practices nationwide? That a lot of agencies that have been through consent decrees that have had this cultural change ahead of us, why don't we learn from them and implement some of that, right? You know, I got asked a question earlier today, and it said, what have you done specifically? What have you created specifically? And I said, really, I can't tell you that I created anything. The best chiefs and the best executive command staff are always asking agencies that went through problems and came out of it a better agency, what did you do? How did you get through that? How can we take a new practice? How can we get better? You know, so with that, you know, as long as you surround yourself with people that are better than you, right? You bring the team together. That's what my goal is here. Bring me a team. Bring me attorneys. Bring me community members. Bring me those people that are much smarter than me, and just let me facilitate them getting us the best practice, best ideas. Teach me the history of Aurora. Teach me the pinch points and the conflicts that we have, and let me help facilitate breaking some of that down and do culture change. And with that culture change comes reduction in force. We're also seeing that in Albuquerque now, some of the lowest force we've had on history. And so, but sometimes, you know, you just got to fire people. Sometimes, unfortunately, even in the state of Texas, state police, we put our own in jail. We arrest our own. If you're an ethical police officer, you will understand the statement that the only people that hate bad cops worse than the citizenry are good cops. Mm-hmm. And we've just got to get to that mentality that bad apples destroy the bunch, you know, and it's going to be my goal to say, look, I want to come to the community at some point and say every police officer that we have is awesome, they're great, they're good, but we know that we've got some apples in there that either need to get on board with change or they need to leave, right? And so with that and a renewed emphasis on empathy and respect, you know, and community base and relational policing, that vision, I think we will see a lot of the reduction in force, and I think we'll see a lot better communication.
So you didn't say anything specifically about racial bias policing? Is there?
Oh, racial, I'm sorry. Yeah. So racial bias policing, you know, one of the things, you know, and I've heard this and read this that, well, we need to get bias, you know, implicit bias or racial bias training. We're going to throw that training out there. The officers are going to take it. We've checked the box. Right? And I don't know that in and of itself is ever going to address anything by saying we checked the box. We need the training. But what we need as important, follow-up post-training, and there needs to be coaching, counseling, and mentoring every single day based upon the training. So sometimes agencies are saying we're going to do this training, we're going to check the box. But when our supervisors don't embrace that as, no, every day you're going to coach, counsel, and mentor on our vision and our goals, and that we're going to be a constitutional relational policing, and there's not going to be any bias about it, mm-hmm. Right? That's how you get change. So a simple training, I know in the consent decree they want training, and all of a sudden that's going to check a box. But I'm a realist. We have to develop and we have to promote those personnel in the department that have a belief in it as a core belief. Mm-hmm. If your moral compass is not one that meets that, you don't need to be a promotion, you don't need to be a sergeant, you don't need to be a lieutenant in the Aurora Police Department.
Mm-hmm. Good. Aspen?
Yes, I mean, the community also has concerns regarding police response for individuals with mental health conditions. What is your plan to reform and train on that as well?
Sure, I think this is a huge problem nationwide. We have police officers using force against people and sometimes killing them just because they're in a mental health crisis. We've seen that in Colorado. We've seen that in Texas. We've seen it in New Mexico. We were under a consent decree for that very reason in New Mexico. One of the things that the Albuquerque, and I want to give great credit to the city of Albuquerque, they created an entirely new department called the Albuquerque Community Safety. Has its own department director. They're predominantly social workers. They have their own vehicles. It's not a co-responder unit. They are a progressive, advanced style unit where they go to encampments. They do education outreach. They're predominantly all social workers, whether they have a Bachelor of Social Work or a Master of Social Work. And what they're able to do is they also take calls. So 911 are diverting calls to clinicians that are actually out and on duty in the city. And so what that does, let's say we have a down and out, someone calls in to say someone's on the sidewalk. You know, a lot of cops are thinking, right, is this a fentanyl overdose? Is it, you know, a drug-induced, you know, coma or something? And police get there, they try to rattle him, they give him Narcan, he starts to get violent and we use force against him. How about we use responses that aren't quite that way, right? How about we have EMS and fire and a community social worker that goes in there and helps them, right? So again, police departments across the nation, all through the 80s, all through the 90s, early 2000s, they were asked to be social workers. They were asked to be, you know, family marital counselors, right? Going to a domestic violence, splitting people up. Can you come talk to my kid about skipping school? So all those things imprinted that cops were always the people that get called for every problem. And this has been going on for a long time. We have got to break that. We've got to say police need to respond to in-progress calls with violence, this, that, the other. If it's a guy, you know, for an example, there's a guy walking around in the intersection and appears that he's talking to himself. Maybe we need to get there to save him, right? He doesn't get hit by a car. But does it have to end up in a use of force, right? Can we get there with a community safety member or with a co-response unit? One thing that I want to bring also is, and again, I have to do a little bit of research. In Texas, we have a licensing under the state licensing, and it's called a mental health officer. So you're a certified mental health officer, and it's a 40-hour block, and it's separate from the crisis intervention training or the enhanced crisis intervention training that you'll go through. It's actually specifically to mental health. When I was at the University of Texas at Arlington as the assistant chief, every one of my patrol officers were mental health officer certified by the state of Texas. And so I know it'd be hard to get 744 people certified in that, but what we saw was a more compassionate officer with the more education that they had. Every person went through autism awareness because we had uses of force against people with autism. You know what I mean? And the officers are only responding to what they've been trained to. So I think for me, we've got to look at a community of a whole, and we've really got to change the way we respond to calls. And we only change how we respond to calls if we change how we dispatch calls. And we only change dispatching calls if we have the other entities on board that can take those calls, you know, for a lack of better terms. And so I think there's a lot of work, but I think we can get it done. You know, we just got to have commitment from everybody, and we got to have a unified voice. I told a group earlier, I said, hey, if all y'all willing to lock arms with me, let's walk in to city council arm in arm and say, you know, we think that this needs to be a change. And so I'm a firm believer in that.
Great.
Awesome.
Great. So Janina and Aspen had great questions. Anything we missed that you would like to make sure that people of Aurora know about you?
I'd like to tell a quick story if
Sure.
you don't mind.
Sure.
So I trained part of a community college law enforcement academy when I retired for like the second time, right before I went to Albuquerque. And we did scenario-based training, which is required in your new consent decree here also. Mm-hmm. And what I was finding is recruits were having some hard times. And so for me to walk a recruit through some of these, you know, very volatile situations like a domestic violence, both on scene, you know, weapons involved, I would slow them down, stop the exercise, and I'd say, hey, what's your lawful objective? What's your legal authority to be here? And then they would give me the statute, you know, or whatever the case may be. And then I'd ask them, okay, well, what's going to be your enforcement plan? And I had one recruit tell me, well, that's for the detectives to find out. My job was just to put him in jail. So I told him, timeout. Is that ethical? And then he said something else to me, and I said, that's not an appropriate attitude. He goes, well, my agency, I said, well, I doubt your agency has rules and regulations for that, because it was a mixed academy. I went home that night and I said, you know what that just spelled is lead. Be lawful, ethical, attitude appropriate, and be disciplined. Follow law and policy. So I started telling my cops after that, I said, man, I think I got something here, and I'm trying to write a white paper on it right now. I said, if you lead every call and build relationships off that call, lead every call, you're going to be okay. If you're not on a call, why don't we add ER to the end of that? Empathy and respect. If you're not on a call, then all you should do is worry about being empathetical and respectful to people. So be a leader every day that you come and lead every call. And that's something that's a mantra of mine. I'm going to write a paper on that and publish it. And to my core, I believe that. And when I'm able to walk recruits through and tell them, lead this call, be lawful, be ethical, have the right attitude, follow policy and law, and they're able to get through scenarios, then I know cops on the street will be able to handle any call and still be constitutional and still be relational.
Great, great.
Awesome.
Thank you, Mr. Franklin,
Yes, sir.
for being here with us today.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks for being a candidate for this tough job. We're glad you're here. Glad you're here.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, all of you that have joined us. Thanks for being engaged with our community and with our city. Thanks, Aspen and Janina, too, for your work. We'll see you later.